Welcome to the Long-Term Investor. In the sidecar today is Jane Ayers, co-founder of Brooklyn FI, also the host of the liquidity event and an expert on all things equity compensation. Jane, thanks so much for joining the show.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me, Peter.
Well, I told you in advance because this is a topic that I think I trip over a lot and listeners trip over a lot, that you're going to really help us sort some things out here when it comes to year-end planning. Maybe we can just start there. What do you feel like are some of the most important tax considerations for year-end planning with stock compensation?
Yeah, so stock compensation, when we think about stock compensation, we have to think about taxes. And often people who are in the wonderful privileged position of being compensated by both a salary and also stock in a private or public company, they have to think about taxes, right? So as we approach year end, the year's almost over, right? We're recording this in early December. Sorry guys, we're kind of out of time at this point. So what are things we can do before the year is over? My best advice for you, if you do have equity compensation, that's part of your compensation package, or you're married to someone who has equity compensation as part of their compensation package, is to do a tax projection, by which I mean grab your pay stubs, figure out how much money you've made, if you've got rental properties, if you've got other investments, and just figure out what your income is for the year and figure out if you've paid in enough tax. Because the biggest, I don't even want to call it a mistake, but the biggest trip up I see our clients make is that they've sold stock, they've made some money, that's great, we've recognized some gains, that's fantastic, they've paid some tax on it, but they haven't paid enough tax because they have more income than they think. So my biggest advice is get a tax projection done. Even if you have RSUs, the regular, which is kind of like our most common type of equity compensation, meaning you're at a public company, you've got some shares vesting quarterly or monthly if they want to make you crazy. They're probably withholding some tax on that, but if you're in a state like New York or California, those are the two ones we see the most with the worst tax surprises. But we often see that you're actually not withholding enough tax on your regular investing shares. So even if you think you're doing everything right, you filled out all the paperwork, you checked all the right boxes, you could still be under withheld. Our clients in New York City, we see folks at the federal level being under withheld by almost 20% sometimes, which if you've sold 6 figures or even 7 figures of stock, that's going to be a pretty nasty tax surprise. So as we approach year end, just know where you're at. And once we have that information, right, once we know what our taxable income is going to be and how much we've actually withheld versus how much we might owe, then we can start to do some real planning, right? We can think about, are there charitable gifts we want to make? We can get really creative with charitable gifts and equity compensation. Are there additional contributions we can make to retirement accounts? Again, probably a little late in the year for that. Are we doing 529 plans for our kids to go to college, or our nieces and nephews to go to college, or ourselves to go to college? So anything we can kind of do in the tax space is what I'm going to recommend right now before the year closes.
Yeah, we're definitely in tax projection season. And while I personally, I'm more investment focused within Plan Corp's practice, but I certainly sit in meetings where people are going through tax projections. And it's not like you can magically erase the tax liability, but I'm always surprised at the shock I see in people's eyes when we talk about accelerating income in a low income year or deferring it into future years or just generally eliminating surprises. And as you pointed out, people paying penalties simply because they didn't know what they've paid in or what they haven't paid in. It's just such low hanging fruit. You definitely should be asking your advisor for a tax projection. And with stock compensation, it gets complicated. And I think you would probably agree with me that it shouldn't be so much of a one-year thing as much as it should be a multi-year thing. How do you think about that when you're working with clients?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's certainly multi-year. Very rarely do I see someone be able to exit a company in a year. In fact, when we see folks getting granted stock, there's often a 1-year cliff, meaning they start working at a company and they don't actually even receive any of that stock as compensation until the 366th day of their employment, right? We call that a cliff. That's fun. It's like jumping off a cliff. It's like, if you jump off this cliff, you might find a couple $1 million of compensation. That's cool. So the way we approach equity compensation planning is a multi-year strategy. And the first question I always ask my clients, I know the right answer, but I'm always curious to hear what they say, which is, how much of this company do you want to hold long term? If you had $1 million of cash sitting on the sidelines, would you invest it all in this company? I realize that's 2 questions. Those are the first 2 questions I asked them. So that gives us a baseline, right? It gives us a baseline of what are the goals of this client? Do they really believe in the future of this company? Are they in it for the long run? Are they an executive where their compensation and their performance is actually going to be tied? The stock price performance, is that going to be tied to their compensation? Like, how invested in this company should they be? Is a good question. And if you're not at that high level, you're not at that executive level, and you're a kind of rank and file employee, but you believe in the future of the company, you maybe have some inside information that you think is an advantage to everyone else who might not have that. I also want you to think about, how much of this do you want to hold long term? Is it, and usually you get this big grant when you first get hired. Do you want to hold 20% of that long term? I hope your company is the next Apple. I hope that for you. Usually with companies going public these days, it takes a long time. And unfortunately, most company stock prices don't do that well. They're not the next Apple. They're not the next Google, the Amazon, fill in the blank here. So a lot of the clients that I'm working with are at companies that are either have recently gone public or are about to go public. So we have to have this really serious conversation about diversification. How much of your net worth do you want tied up in this one asset? It's a pretty big gamble to take. Not only is it your income that you're probably using to provide for your family, but it's also, you're taking much more risk than you probably need to. So our approach when we're thinking about multi-year planning is, how quickly can we diversify out of this, what we call a concentrated position? How quickly can we do that with taxes in mind and with the client's specific goals in mind? Also with equity compensation, we have all these crazy rules, which we don't really have to get into, but there's all these requirements about holding periods, just like a regular stock. If you buy a stock and you hold it for more than a year, you get better tax treatment. So we kind of have the same thing with certain types of equity compensation. So when I'm thinking about, new client walks in the door and they've got some equity and they've got, some restricted stock units, some RSUs, they've got some stock options also. We're not just looking at what are we doing this week or this month or this year. We're looking at what is the 5-year plan for us to have you be in a position where you've extracted some wealth. That's the most important thing. Hopefully paid fewer taxes than you would have if you didn't work with a firm like ours. That's always our goal, right? Reduce taxes in any way we can. And also I want you to feel, I don't want this stock price to ruin your life, to take over your life. And this is a big threat that we see, which is, Peter, you work with lots of investors. Like, investing money in the stock market is, it's hard, right? It goes up, it goes down. It can be a bit of a roller coaster. I'm sure you give your clients this advice, like, don't look at your portfolio every day. Don't do it. It would be better if you don't. It would be better if you just never looked at it for 30 years and then be happy with the results, right?
100%.
Right. Don't you wish you could say that to all your clients? That would be the dream. Unfortunately, when so much of your net worth as a holder of equity compensation is tied up in one company, how could you not check the stock price every day, right? And I bet the people you work with are talking about the stock price. You're in meetings. And like I said, maybe your literal compensation is tied to that performance of that stock price. So you're thinking about it all the time. I have had clients lose their minds basically over, this is so stressful. I'm going to have a heart attack. I can't have this, I'm working hard and I don't want one day to wake up and look at my portfolio and I can buy that $3 million house. And the next day we got to file for bankruptcy because that stock is worthless. So my goal is always to reduce kind of that roller coaster of equity compensation if I can.
I wrote down something you just said. Don't let that stock price ruin your life. And it's perfect because a lot of times, I will admit, I think of people ruining their life from a net worth statement perspective. Just the likelihood of any individual stock experiencing a catastrophic loss is probably higher than most people realize. But kind of digging deeper, as you touch on, ruining your life where you're thinking about your company's stock price all the time and how distracting that can be. I know I do some financial wellness work with a company called Bright Plan, where I'm also the chief investment officer. And a lot of what we see, just how stress impacts your own productivity, your own mental health. And so this multi-year planning, I love that you take that approach where, number one, you want to extract wealth. And yes, we're trying to minimize taxes. We're probably trying to spread across tax impacts so that you can maybe avoid a certain tax bracket over a couple of years. But then the other thing you said that stuck out to me that I don't think it's explored enough, on my show or anywhere else, is you mentioned working with people pre-IPO at private companies. Let's kind of pull on that string a little bit. What do you feel like are the key considerations when deciding whether to exercise stock options when you're at a private company that maybe people haven't thought of before?
Yes, and I love this question. So just to talk about myself for a little bit and how I wound up in this weird position of being one of the country's experts in equity compensation, which is so wild to me because if we had met 10 years ago, you would have found me interviewing bands and going to shows and writing album reviews. So I was a music journalist and and I wrote books and I edited books. So was my previous career before I found myself here running a wealth management firm. But, life is twisty and turny. So here we are. But actually, the first time I learned about equity compensation was because I worked at a music tech company and I was running their online music magazine. And part of my compensation was incentive stock options. So that was really my first kind of foray into personal finance in general. I didn't even know what a Roth IRA was at that point. And someone handed me a stock option agreement. And I was like, well, I have no idea what this is. So I'm just going to file this in the drawer and worry about that later. So I have very firsthand experience in, what does it mean to be granted equity? What does it mean to not understand it at all? And I actually ended up having a liquidity event from that music tech company. They went through an acquisition. I actually ended up, and I'm going to answer your question, I promise.
No, you go as long as you need. Yeah.
I ended up exercising my stock options when I left the company, right? So to me, like the baseline, when is the best time to exercise your options? Well, don't lose them. So if you're going to leave the job, whether because you're fired or you're laid off or you get a better job or you retire and you self-select out of leaving this company, that is a kind of like a no-brainer. Like, let's stop and make sure we exercise these options before we leave. Typically, you have 90 days to do that from your date of separation. Sometimes you can extend it. 90 days goes by real quickly, folks. So if you're thinking about leaving your company and you want to exercise those options, start thinking about it ahead of time. I have never seen it go very smoothly when someone wants to leave a company and exercise options. It just takes a long time. That's the obvious answer. When do you exercise? When you're leaving the company. In a perfect world, if I could create the perfect equity timeline, and we do have clients like this where, and these are clients who have had 7-8-figure exits even before these companies go public, which is wild. This is when you're hired early days of the company, you're one of the first couple employees, you're probably granted incentive stock options, or ISOs. They're just treated differently than other stock options. I don't want to get into the details, but they can be very valuable because if you play your cards right and you do this, you time it perfectly, you actually won't pay any income tax on them at all, which is pretty cool. So ideally, you get hired early on, or maybe you're the founder and you have incentive stock options. You exercise those options, meaning you buy them as soon as you get them. Or within a year, or whenever they vest, whenever you're able to do that. Maybe your company offers an early exercise. So if you just got hired at a new company that's still private, you might want to ask them if early exercise is available. That can be very valuable. So you exercise your options, and your grant price, your strike price, the price you're going to pay to exercise is going to be equal to what that stock is worth. That's what we want. That's the moment where we're not paying any tax on it. So if you can do that, and your options cost, if you're early on, less than a penny or less than $1, you're only paying a couple $1,000s to own a significant portion of that company that hopefully will just keep going up and up. So the way we see these large, life-changing lottery ticket payouts is early exercise of incentive stock options, wait it out. Company's about to go public. Other investors want to get in. They want to buy those shares from you. Now the shares are worth $4 or $5, maybe $70, which we've seen before. Thank you, Datadog. We love you so much. When that happens, that's when you're going to see this massive gain, right? And you're only paying capital gains tax on that. And if you played your cards right and you held those shares for 5 years, you potentially have qualified small business stock or QSBS, and you potentially are not paying any tax on the first 10 million of gain there. So that's really like how to game the system. And I remember like learning about all these theories and being like, whoa, that's really cool. And then when I saw it for the first time, I was like, oh, okay, this is, I like this I like this part of the tax code. Like, I'm down with this.
I mean, I'll tell you from personal experience, I have ISOs in a private company. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. And it seems like you use the word lottery ticket, which seems like a good comparison because there's no guarantee that the company will go public or that it will exit. And so look, what you're talking about is an incredible deal. The cost of it is literally the cost of exercising those options and maybe them not being worth anything. Sure. And I think, let me ask you this. I mean, is there a point in time where you look at someone's financial plan or their net worth statement and you say, hey, this risk isn't really worth it. If it pays off, you'll just be happy and it's a cherry on top, versus, no, you should spend this money. It is a good bet if you're feeling confident that your company is going to be worth something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do believe there is such a thing as taking on too much risk. Like I said, we don't want to over concentrate in this one private or public company. And my public is less risky to me because there is a public market. So worst case, you could always sell your shares to the public market, whereas private, there are often so many restrictions that you actually cannot sell your shares. There literally is no market for them. Maybe the company has put restrictions. Maybe if you have like a weird bad breakup with your company, they will maliciously restrict you in selling your shares, which we've seen before. So yes, there is such thing as too much risk. Often what I see is people coming to me, clients, and just friends or people who know that I love this stuff and will happily talk to anyone about it at any time because I'm a nerd. They'll come to me and say, hey, it'll cost me $20,000 to exercise my options. I like this company, but I don't know. The leadership is kind of wacky, and I got this better job. Like, I'm leaving, so I have 90 days to decide what should I do. We're financial planners. We like rules of thumb. So a good rule of thumb, if it's more than 10% of your balance sheet, your liquid net worth, probably too risky. Unless you're already financially independent, then great. We love risk. That's the beauty of financial independence. Like, I named my company Brooklyn FI. The FI stands for financial independence. Once you have that, you have this freedom to make riskier decisions that have less impactful consequences. So yeah, if you're financially independent, go ahead, take that risk. If it's going to prevent you from doing the upgrade on your house that you need, or, getting that second car that you need, or sending your kid to college, taking that bet is probably too risky. Every investor is different. Certain people have different risk profiles. So I have certainly tried to convince a client before, saying like, I think this is too risky, and I've been overridden, and that's fine. Like, we had the conversation. I documented it, of course, just to make sure. And look, I always tell clients, especially with equity compensation, I hope I'm wrong. I always hope I'm wrong, because I'm going to encourage clients to take a little bit of risk off the table. I hope that your company is the next Apple. And I hope that you're exercising at $5 and spending half of your net worth to do this. And I hope in 3 years you are a deca millionaire. I really hope that for you. However, I'm often right. And often that stock is going to take a long time to recover, and your life goals are not going to align with how the stock price is moving. Great example. We have one of our nearest and dearest clients, early employee at Spotify. Spotify's stock price has been all over the place. Right now it's trading at almost $500, but 3 years ago it was below $100 a share. Client had a bunch of kids, needed to do a renovation on their house, needed cash. We needed cash at that moment. So we ended up selling some Spotify stock. And I guarantee you that person, I haven't heard this directly, but I'm sure it's the case, is going, why did I sell at $100 when I could have sold at $500? But they did the home renovation. The kids had their beautiful backyard, all's well that ends well. We always try to create, I like this, a scenario of least regret. Like, did we do enough, right? Did we take enough risk so that we could potentially have that lottery outcome? Or just did we sit on our hands and do nothing, which is kind of the worst thing we can do. Just before we leave this topic, thinking about, exercising your options, when you're leaving a company, you don't have to do it all, remember, right? You don't have to do the full amount that's available to you. I like setting just a dollar amount. Like, what is comfortable for you? Is it $5,000? Is it $10,000? Is it $50,000? Great. Let's do a tax projection, because there might be some taxes associated with that exercise, but let's just come up with our budget. So at least you did something and you feel good about that, and you can have that lottery ticket kind of sitting in your drawer.
And that's probably true whether you're leaving a company or staying, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the urgency, it's like leaving a company or even like getting a job offer from another company, like forces you to make decisions. Another thing that's wild about equity compensation is that if you are at a public company and you're consistently getting granted, you have to make a decision every quarter. You have to make a big financial decision literally every quarter. I don't know about you, Peter, but like, I get decision fatigue, like choosing like what I'm having for dinner. And these are people who have to decide, like, am I comfortable selling this stock at $50 or what have you? So one way around that we found is really helpful is to create a trading plan. And basically, we write up a document and we say, these are the shares, these are the number of shares I want to sell. This is the floor price I'm comfortable with. This is how many I'm going to sell each quarter. That's kind of like how we do our multi-year kind of strategic planning, where we're looking at taxes and the rest of the net worth as well.
Is there anything else you mentioned when somebody's leaving a company? Is there anything else people ought to be keeping in mind as it pertains to their equity compensation when they depart, or they're thinking about departing?
Make friends with the accounting and HR teams, because you're going to need them when the company goes public, because you will be looking for documents and you will need assistance. And I say that in jest, but actually, that is, to me, the biggest threat with equity compensation is like admin of these companies that flip from private to public. Hey, I need to exercise my shares on this date because I like the price, because the fair market value, what we call the 409A, is going up next week. I need to exercise this week. Oh, someone's out of the office, yada, yada, yada. Like, call your girl in HR and she will help you with that exercise.
That's great advice.
Yeah, what else when you're leaving? I mean, yeah, just be aware of those time restrictions, 90 days. If it's a smaller company and it's still private, you probably have a little bit more negotiating power than you think. I've had folks at, companies that are sub 50 employees. You can actually ask and you can say, hey, is it possible to convert this option grant into non-qualified options? So they were incentive stock options. Now they're going to become non-qualified options. You will actually have up to 10 years to then exercise those shares. So you that 90 days becomes irrelevant. They convert to this other type of equity, but you can actually ask for that. I've actually seen companies rewrite their option plan agreements. I've actually helped them rewrite them to allow for this, because it's a great benefit to employees. It's an accounting headache for the company. To have all this equity out there that may or may not be, exercised at any point. But that's like a great kind of thing to ask for if they're amenable to it. So,
now, you had mentioned a client you worked with at Spotify, which is ironic because there's somebody I have in mind that I have worked with from Spotify, and the price was soaring during the pandemic, and they were acquiring podcasts, and then it plummeted when interest rates started to go up. And I remember that person saying, gosh, if it would ever get up to 270, I would sell all of it. And now, here we are, well past that point.
We're looking at 500.
Right, exactly. And I think it's an important narrative for those of you listening with individual stock we say this not in jest or in making fun of anybody, but it is a really emotional ride. And I think there are times, at least in Spotify's case, people are getting an opportunity to exercise with an appreciated price. But how do you think about exercising options during a period where the share price is a bit depressed?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, because yes, we've seen this with Spotify. Spotify is also unique because they have a very tight exercise window. So typically we see, when we see stock option grants, you have 10 years to exercise from the date that it's granted to you. Spotify's is 5. They also have a very flexible equity menu, if you will, sort of like we call it a choose your own adventure. They let you pick what you want. You can do cash, you can do RSUs, you can do options, which I think I'd like to think is well-intentioned. I believe it is well-intentioned, but it also just, again, creates a choice for every Spotify employee. So yes, what do we do when we have underwater stock options? I was actually an underwater stock option for Halloween last year. So.
Okay, I'm going to have to see a picture of that for the show notes.
I was Ariel I do dumb equity compensation Halloween costumes each year. Anyway, underwater stock option share price. I do not like recommending that people exercise underwater options. Again, it's a risk question. You are basically taking one step backwards, especially if you already own a position in that company, you have other holdings. However, there are certain situations where our hand might be forced, like you're leaving the company, and you will lose access to these options. Should you go ahead and should you concentrate more of your wealth in this company while you're overpaying for options and potentially paying taxes that you're not going to get back? That's a truly case. I hate the financial planner, axiom, like it depends, but that's a true case of it depends. Are you comfortable taking on this much risk? Are you okay with making an objectively bad decision, right? On paper, it's a bad decision. Why are you doing this? Sometimes we have to.
Now, when you have a mix, you kind of mentioned this. It feels like I'm going to try not to turn it into a Spotify specific question. You mentioned all the different options they have, but a lot of companies, you will end up with a mix of ISOs, non-qualified stock options, RSUs, and especially if you're jumping around companies. A lot of people who are in the world receiving equity compensation get a little bit addicted to equity comp packages and bounce around. Are there any advanced strategies that you find yourself talking about when people have a mix of these different forms of compensation?
Absolutely. I feel like a kid in a candy store when I see a client come in the door. I've got ISOs over here and RSUs over here and non-quals over here. Really we have two levers to pull in equity compensation, and it's what are our stock options? What are our incentive stock options? Because those have that different tax treatment. They follow the alternative minimum tax, or AMT, and then we have our non-qualified options and our RSUs, just our regular stock grants. There are many other acronyms for various types of equity compensation, but in terms of like tax treatment, they can fall into one of those three categories. So one of my favorite, let's call it an advanced strategy, is when you do have that mix of ISOs over here and let's call it RSUs over here, or non-qualified options over here, you can actually force an exercise. So with non-qualified options, you can say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and exercise. I'm going to sell them the next day. I'm going to recognize the gain. No problem. I've inflated my income, right? I've brought my income up, which because of the tax code and because of the way alternative minimum tax works, we've now basically created a budget for ourselves to potentially exercise and hold some of those incentive stock options without triggering any additional alternative minimum tax. So it's kind of like this magical seesaw, if you will, of what is the optimal point of recognizing income and also not paying alternative minimum tax? So much so that we used to do this in spreadsheets, but my business partner and I were like, there's got to be a better way. So we actually built an algorithm. We built a tech tool called GEM, where it actually tells you what is the optimal amount of this, exercising this and selling this and recognizing this gain over here. And Peter, you mentioned, folks having equity at 3, 4. We have a client who has equity at 11 different companies.
Wow.
You can't manage that in a spreadsheet. Like, I'm sorry. And if you get married, by the way, your spouses, all of their equity compensation, usually people meet their spouse at work. That's what the statistics tell us. Although I think that's fallen below the dating apps at this point. But people often end up marrying people they work with. So chances are we're going to have equity at all different types of companies. We're going to have RSUs, ISOs, all that stuff. That's an interesting planning opportunity for a financial planner like me, but it is a nightmare, right? Again, it's a lot of decisions to make.
I'm glad you mentioned the technology that you and your partner Shane built. I'm going to link to that in the show notes at thelongterminvestor.com for all of the other advisor geeks listening to this conversation, watching this conversation. You should set up a demo with Allie Jane. I've seen it. It is very cool, very impressive. And yes, at a certain point, doing it in a spreadsheet doesn't make sense. It's hard to get creative that way. And maybe that's an interesting place to go with you because you're such an expert. I wonder, are there any creative strategies for preserving the gains without triggering taxes immediately that you're able to talk to your clients about this time of year?
I hate this question, Peter. I knew you were going to ask me this question.
Make magic happen, please. That's what the clients want.
I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have a magic wand, unfortunately. I have seen our clients be sold things like synthetic hedges. I think those are a great way for banks to increase their profits by selling you these contracts. I think when we're talking about trying to hedge against one individual stock, at the base, it's like an expensive way of just selling the damn stock. I think there are other ways to lessen the tax impact of a large gain. The most obvious one, which is the entire focus of our Brooklyn FI's investing strategy, is very aggressive and active tax loss harvesting. Starting from the moment you walk in the door as a client, if we do our client onboarding, do you have equity compensation? Okay, great. Let's flag that for our portfolio team because we need to do everything we can in your portfolio to generate, I guess we can call them synthetic, to generate actual losses in anticipation of having this gain in the future. And what a lot of people don't realize is that if you recognize a loss in your diversified investment portfolio, you can carry that loss forward as long as you want. You're limited each year by $3,000. But again, talking about if you check all the right boxes and we follow this optimal timeline, you become a client. We spend 3 or 4 years racking up hundreds of thousands of dollars of losses in your portfolio. When you do have that exit at the end, we get to knock off a lot of that because we've got this synthetic loss attached to your tax return. So to me, that's the most obvious valuable strategy. Unfortunately, it's not a silver bullet. We can't do that on December 2nd and just magically, make that gain disappear. If you're charitably inclined, one of my favorite strategies with equity compensation is to actually donate your appreciated securities. So if you're an early Apple employee, congratulations. Never make a cash contribution ever again. Let's defer the gain to the 501c3. They don't have to pay taxes. So just donate. You get the full value of the stock today, and you never actually have to recognize that gain. So in the purest form, that's the best way to defer the gain. Obviously, you have to have the budget and the inclination to want to donate to charity in the first place. But I do like that strategy.
Yeah, if you have equity compensation and you're making cash charitable gifts, you need to call Allie, Jane, or myself right now. I feel like listeners of this show, viewers of this show, hear me talk all the time about the value of an advisor. Let's hear it in your words, particularly within the context of specializing in equity compensation. What do you see the benefit being?
So have you ever seen the Titanic?
The Titanic, like the movie?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually, I'm really embarrassed to say I haven't.
Okay,
I'm very familiar. You asked me like the most embarrassing cultural thing that I missed out on. I know the songs. I know Leonardo DiCaprio's in it, but very familiar with the Titanic.
So, this might not work then. But anyway.
Every single listener, viewer is going to be familiar with whatever it is you're about to say.
All right, I'm going to try. So in the Titanic, there's this like beautiful like locket that like falls to the bottom of the ocean.
I'm even familiar with this.
You're familiar with that, right? And you're familiar with the Britney Spears song, Oops, I Did It Again. And then he goes, well, baby, I went down and got it for you. Okay, so that's how I feel like as an advisor in equity compensation. Because what can happen sometimes, and this might sound crazy to your listeners, but I have seen this happen 4 times that I can think of right now, where someone in the past has exercised incentive stock options. Maybe they paid some taxes. They probably paid some taxes, and then they probably fired their accountant because they didn't like that they paid taxes and they assumed it was the accountant's fault. It was not the accountant's fault. You owed the taxes anyway. They fire their accountant. Then the next year, no equity compensation, no problem. They prepare their own taxes. What has happened is that they have forgotten their alternative minimum tax credit. It's this form that gets attached to your tax return. So if you change accountants or you prepare your own taxes, we can literally lose this AMT credit. So this, oops, I did it again. Well, baby, I went down and got it for you. We have found, in the most extreme case, $125,000. But also other amounts. So to me, that's the value of having someone looking at everything. Like I said, thinking about tax arbitrage in your portfolio, thinking about taxes every step of the way is so important when you have equity compensation. So if you do have equity compensation, make sure that your advisor is not only aware of your tax situation, hopefully they're preparing your tax return also. That's what we do. Like I do not understand how someone could advise someone on equity compensation without actually preparing the return, because there are so many little details that can get lost, as we've just learned. So at worst case, your CPA and your advisor should at least have a conversation before the year is over, just to make sure that no stone, every stone was unturned or whatever. I'm bad at analogies. You know what I meant. What's the correct one?
Yeah, I think you don't want to leave
no stone unturned. There we go.
I mean, I haven't seen the Titanic, so we know there's something wrong with me.
And look, I think those are the kind of big ones. Tax. Having someone who can walk you through this roller coaster. It is emotional having that partner who can say, yep, we've been through this before with hundreds of other clients. We know how this rodeo goes. Buckle up. We're going to help you through this. And when bad things happen, having that advisor go, oh, wow, you just got fired for cause. That's a big, huge problem in the equity compensation realm. By the way, we have the best equity compensation attorney we can refer you to make sure that we don't, lose out on the millions of dollars that you're owed for your 5 years of service at this company. So it is kind of the Wild West. Equity compensation is new. A lot of the, Microsoft kind of wrote a lot of the templates that every company uses now in terms of, how big are these grants? Who should get equity compensation? I think it used to be mostly founders and software engineers. But now it's kind of just standard. If you're an employee at a company that is, heavily, that is VC funded, you've probably got a grant. I mean, I'm a great example of that. I was a music journalist and I had ISOs. Like, come on. Like we've reached like peak equity compensation. So yeah, I think I talk to a lot of folks and I try to convince them to hire me. And I talk to a lot of software engineers who, operate at such a high level of thought and analysis. And I love when clients are smarter than me. That's my favorite. And they pull out their spreadsheets and I'll go like, wow, that's pretty good, actually. Can you send that to me? But I really think like having a thought partner to get through this, to get to the other side and really kind of zooming out, if you will, and thinking about like, what is the end goal here? What are we trying to do here? And for most people, it's, I want to have money, time, and freedom to spend with the people I love. So if the outcome is, I want to pay off my house, buy my mom a house, make sure my kids are set up, but not so well set up that they're going to be spoiled, like, great. Well, then we don't need to ride this roller coaster. Tomorrow, I can make you financially independent if we split this exit over 2 years. We can do this quickly. Why are we taking on all this additional risk and headache for something that, based on what you just told me, you can have everything you've ever wanted in 8 months? And that's like a pretty compelling answer, right? Like you'd be like, okay, cool. Yeah, sounds good. So I think that's the true value, is like let's keep our goals in mind at all times.
So Allie Jane, before we close out, we've covered a lot of ground, but sometimes when someone like me is not an expert, I don't know what questions I should have been asking. So let's close with this. Are there any other tips or ideas or final thoughts that you really want to leave with the audience?
Let's see. I think an underutilized plan in this space is called a 10b5-1 plan. And typically we see these plans, by law, the CEO and CFO are typically required to have them. So if you're an executive at a publicly traded company, to protect you and investors, you need to tell the public, the investing public, what trades you're going to make over the next couple of years. Because it is impossible for the CEO and CFO to hide themselves from insider information because they are literally creating the financial plans and forecasts for the company. So in order to kind of protect everyone, we basically have these, for lack of it's literally a spreadsheet, and you just put the date that you're going to sell, how many shares you want to sell, and the floor price or the max share price that you want to sell. So I love these plans. They're typically available to executives, but we have seen a lot of companies offer these to rank and file employees, which is really cool. I love these plans. I think they take a lot of the stress out of equity compensation and deciding when to sell. It's also annoying to go in there every quarter and sell what you want. So even if you have a plan to actually go and execute, if you're anchored to a stock price of $70 and you go in there to sell and it's $55, are you actually going to sell? I don't know. I've seen people not do that. So we love these 10b5-1 plans where the trades just automatically go through. At Brooklyn FI, what we do is we actually create synthetic ones for our clients. We actually take custody of the account. So we will go in and trade for our clients according to this plan that they've already signed off on. So that takes a lot of stress and headache and uncertainty out of it. So they just, wake up at the end of the year and all of their concentrated position has moved in magically to the diversified portfolio. So love a 10b5-1 plan. It really prevents insider trading. There's
no need to go to jail just trying to extract some wealth, right?
Yeah, and I think that's another thing. If you are leaving a company, make sure you read those documents and don't do any wacky trades just because you left yesterday. Like, you could still be on the hook depending on your level and access to information. You could still be on the hook for that insider trading policy for 6 to 12 months after you leave the company. So let's not break any laws accidentally, folks.
No, we don't want to do any of that. Allie Jane, you have been incredible today. Just in case people want to find more and learn more about you, where should they be going?
You can find me and my firm, Brooklyn FI, at brooklynfi.com. I also have a podcast called The Liquidity Event, where we used to talk about IPOs every week. We used to do an IPO deep dive, but we have been in an IPO drought since 2022. So it is mostly just my business partner and I chatting about investing and other personal finance topics each week. And you can find that on any podcast platform Friday mornings.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. I recommend the show. It is something that always pops up on my phone each and every week. I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes at thelongterminvestor.com. But until then, whether you're watching, listening, do all the things that help people find what Allie Jane just taught us. That's like, subscribe, leave reviews, do all the things. We really appreciate your time today, Allie Jane. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.